We can talk later. I can hear them drinking there. Hopefully more people are coming, but it's about time, so we should be starting, guys. Let's get started with today's CAN seminar series. We have one of our own as the presenter. This is Issam Qamhia. Issam actually has joined us since back in 2014. Before that, he was at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, doing his master's work. Since 2014, Issam has been working with me on unbound aggregate materials, and actually recent project that we have an ongoing project with ICT, all that. Again, Professor Ozer and I, we are doing this on basically the sustainable uses of some byproduct material, that is the quarry byproducts, right? And Issam made this talk, gave this talk at TRB. This is TRB submission 185170, paper number, and it is on really the first cell of what we constructed and tested. We have been testing since last year in the field under our Atlas trafficking tests, field performance evaluation of quarry byproducts used in unbound aggregate layers constructed over soft subgrade. I think what we thought about for Issam to do today is to give this presentation the same way it was presented at TRB in January, but also he had an invited speech given at the Chemical Stabilization Committee of TRB, which is related to more like the cells 2 and 3 of his test sections here that had to do with cement and fly stabilization of quarry byproduct applications. So he will be talking about both the unbound aggregate application of quarry byproducts as well as the stabilized application. So without further ado, Issam, take over.
Thank you, Professor Tutumler, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Professor just mentioned, I will start with the first presentation, which is the TRB presentation, field performance evaluation of quarry byproducts used in unbound aggregate layers constructed over soft subgrade. I will start with acknowledging my co-authors for this paper, Professor Errol Tutumler and Professor Hassan Ozer, who are with us in the audience, and then Sheila Bashirs and Heather Shub from Illinois Department of Transportation, as well as Hassan Kazbi. To start with, I'll start with the motivation and an introduction section about what motivated our study. So basically in 2016, and this is the most recent statistics, there was almost 1.5 billion metric tons of crushed stones that were produced in the United States alone. Out of these 1.48 billion metric tons, there was around 175 million tons of quarry byproducts that were generated in these quarries, which actually makes the quarry byproducts approximately 11.8% of the aggregate mined is actually quarry byproducts or waste fine. And quarrying other types of aggregates such as limestone and dolomite can produce high amounts of fines up to 20 to 25%. And thus, you can see that stockpiling and disposing these materials can be a major problem that is facing the aggregate industry in terms of finding space for it, for landfills, as well as interfering with their operations. So what are quarry byproducts? Quarry byproducts are also known as quarry fines or quarry dust. They're typically 6 millimeter in size materials or finer than that. Basically, they're coarse, medium, and fine sand particles with small fractions of clay and silt that are passing number 200 sieve. And these are produced in quarry processes such as blasting, crushing, and screening. Just talking about Illinois now, after I gave the statistics about the United States. So the production of quarry byproducts in Illinois can be high and can be as high as 950,000 tons of quarry byproducts each year is the excess QB that is being produced with a recent survey that was done in a previous project related to my project based on responses of aggregate quarries and producers in the state of Illinois. So just an overview of the constructed test sections that we have, and we're trying to propose some applications for quarry byproducts in pavement constructions. So we proposed 16 different applications, and we divided those into 3 different cells, cell 1, cell 2, and cell 3. In this presentation, I will focus mainly on cell 1, which is the unbound applications of Quarry byproducts to be used in the construction over very soft subgrade. So these test sections were constructed on CBR1 subgrade, engineered subgrade, and the different applications were for low volume roads as well as for construction platforms. As for the applications, they were combining or blending Quarry byproduct with large aggregates that can be up to 6 inches in size, called primary crusher run aggregates, and constructing them in two practices, either a two-lift construction or a one-lift construction. The other applications concern using Quarry byproducts or consuming more Quarry byproducts by allowing a higher percentage of fines into dense graded aggregate subgrade layers constructed on top of soft subgrade. So the learning outcome from the experiment of cell 1 are basically two learning outcomes. The first learning outcome is using higher percentage of materials passing number 200 sieve and investigating if this will work, as well as the effect of the type of fine, plastic versus non-plastic fines. The other outcome is using Quarry byproducts to fill the gaps between large rocks as aggregate subgrade on soft subgrade layers. And this was actually inspired from a previous study that was done where those large rocks were used as aggregate fill materials on top of soft subgrade, but there was issues with variation in the rutting as well as the performance in those layers. And part of the experiment is to learn the effect of the construction practice in constructing those layers in one or two lifts. So talking about the IDOT gradation bands, general introduction. So there are several gradation bands. The two that are of concern in this study are the CSO2 gradation band, which is the large aggregates that are mainly larger than 2 inches in size and can be up to 6 inches in size. And there's the CS6 gradation band, which is a dense graded typical base course or sub-base material used. It has a top size or maximum nominal aggregate size of 1 or 1.5 inch, and 4 to 12% fines material passing number 200, and we're trying to investigate using higher than the 12%, 15% fines. So for the layer thicknesses that were constructed, basically the main reference was the Subgrade Stability Manual, which was updated in 2005, which requires for very soft subgrade soils of CBR1 layer thicknesses of about 21, 22 inches on top of the soft subgrade as a remedial action when we have a low CBR of CBR1. Notice that the manual doesn't specify the quality of those aggregates, but just requires the thickness of the material. So for the materials selection for the different test sections, we were collecting materials from different regions in Illinois, from different aggregate producers and quarries. For cell 1 in particular, the materials that were used are Quarry byproduct from one quarry in Illinois, the large aggregates, the primary crusher runs, as well as 3 different dense graded types of aggregate. CS6 regular is a capping material that we used, and it has the regular percentage of fine that is currently permitted, as well as 2 materials that were engineered for this project at a higher percentage of fines, 15% non-plastic fines and 15% plastic fines with a plasticity index of 8. And those were occupied from 2 quarries in Moline area and 1 near St. Louis. For the other cells that I will talk about later, we were blending Quarry byproducts and stabilizing them. Quarry byproducts were blended with the RAP or recycled concrete aggregates, and we also obtained these from some local sources in Champaign. So we started with some characterization of the field materials. This is the gradation of all the materials that were used in cell 1. Essentially, we did the moisture density characterization because when we constructed the test sections, we constructed everything and compacted it at the optimal moisture content in order to get high compaction, relative compaction. And as you see the gradations, this is this large aggregates. It has open graded material with very large sizes, and then the Quarry byproduct is the finest gradation, while the other 3 materials, they fall within the gradation band for the CS6 of IDOT, shown here with the dashed lines, and 2 of them have the higher fine content than the currently permitted 12% fines content. Also, as part of this study, in order to study the first 2 applications that I mentioned, which is mixing Quarry byproducts with the large aggregates and blending them, we didn't have any previous studies performed on this subject, so we didn't know what is an appropriate mixing ratio or what is the appropriate procedure to mix the two materials together. So we investigated with that. In the lab, we had a preliminary study in order to see how can we pack these materials together. Our envision was to put the large rocks first and then put the quarry byproducts on the surface and use a vibratory action in order to shake those quarry byproducts inside the inherent voids in the structure of the large aggregates. And in order to do that, we constructed a box, a steel box. We call it the UIUC compaction box or the packing box. It has one side that is made of plexiglass so that we can monitor what's going on and take pictures of the cross-section. And the dimensions of the box were appropriate for the dimensions of the large aggregates, which are 6 inches maximum. And the height is similar to the height of the lifts that are constructed in the lab. And we did some packing tests. So there was a test matrix composed of 14 different tests for just the large rocks and how they pack in the box, then the large rocks with quarry byproducts that were completely dry and varying the amount from 20% to 40%, which is roughly the maximum void content that we have between the large rocks, as well as varying the subgrade or the foundation condition from the steel box into a subgrade soil, soft subgrade soil, and seeing the difference, and also using some wet quarry byproducts because we expect that the material that we get from the quarries will not be completely dry, and how that affects the compaction. So this is just some summary of the tests and how the big rocks pack together, which enabled us to calculate the void ratios and the porosity of the material, and in order to estimate what amount of quarry byproducts to add. This is a slide showing the sequence of the testing from putting the large rocks and then putting the quarry byproducts, shaking them or compacting it, and then looking at the cross-section, top view and cross-section, then putting the other layer, compacting it, and then what is the final view. So this was more of a qualitative study to investigate the packing. Here is showing how the quarry byproducts were added from the top of the surface, and then this is showing on the left bottom graph the compaction of the quarry byproducts between the voids. So in the lab, it was working, and our conclusion with the different various 14 tests, when we added the soft subgrade that we have and the wet quarry byproduct, is that with a 2.7% moisture content, 25% quarry byproduct by the weight of the large rock is recommended for a single lift and a 2-lift application in the field. And that was the first investigation. So for the field construction and monitoring, as I was showing before, these are the cells or the sections in cell 1, considering with the unbound applications of quarry byproducts. So we have 4 construction platforms that are not paved, and then 4 paved test sections, 21 inches of materials, then 3 inches of capping material, and 4 inches of HMA on the top. And each test cell is divided into 2 test sections and then transition zones on both sides. One is for crawler area as well as speed stabilization, and the one in the middle is to minimize the interference between the different test sections when it's tested with accelerated pavement testing. One first step at the field was the subgrade engineering and preparation, and in order to do that, as I mentioned, cell 1 was engineered to a subgrade 1 CBR, so we had to engineer the top 12 inches of the subgrade, and that was done by a moisture adjustment as well as compaction, and then using the dynamic cone penetrometer or the DCP to calculate the penetration rates and then relate that to the CBR in order to get a consistent CBR across the whole cell as well across the depth of the cell for the top 12 inches at least. And this is a graph showing the trials that were done, and as you can see, starting with the first trial, how variable the soil can be. And then as we do iteration of adjusting the moisture and tilling and compacting and testing, we get more consistent until the final trial where we achieve a CBR of less than 1 across the whole cell, as well as is very consistent also within the depth of the cell. So this shows the subgrade soil underneath the construction platforms. And this one is a similar idea, but this is for the subgrade soil underneath the paved test sections. And this is just a comparison of the two test sections. This is the target CBR at 1%, and all the test sections were constructed on soil that had a CBR of 1% or less, and we were able to achieve that for all 8 test sections. Now, after the construction of the subgrade soil and engineering the subgrade soils comes the construction of the field test sections, or the unbound test layers that have the Quarry byproduct applications. The first two that I mentioned are the ones that have the primary crusher runs, or the large blocks with the Quarry byproduct mixed together and constructed in 2 lifts or in 1 lift. So we first examined with constructing the first lift of the 2-lift application. So we had the large blocks placed, and then we had the Quarry byproduct, the amount, the 25% placed on the top, and then spread with a skid steer and then compacted. And we were trying to simulate what we had in the lab by compacting it, that we have a vibratory action that will actually make the Quarry byproducts percolate into the voids of the large rocks. But what we had in the field is actually that we ended up with a layer of Quarry byproducts sitting on the surface, compacted, like thin layer compacted on the surface instead of percolating inside and then inhibiting any further Quarry byproducts from going inside. So we had to somehow fix the situation that we had, and in order to do that, we used the bucket of a backhoe loader in order to mix the two materials together. And we were now inspecting, like, what's the difference between the lab and the field, and we found out that if we put the whole amount on the top in one time, then we're actually going to compact the Quarry byproduct in a layer instead of making it inside, as well as the vibratory effort matters. So we need a larger vibration instead of using the small roller vibratory that we were using. So we investigated with that for the second layer of the 2-lift construction, as well as for the 1-lift construction test section, where we were applying the Quarry byproducts incrementally instead of just putting the whole amount on the surface at once. And then we were using also a larger roller compactor. And I'm just showing a video here of this operation. And this operation was completely successful. We were able to get the Quarry byproducts inside the voids. This one shows the roller vibrator before and after spreading the Quarry byproducts and how they are entering inside the voids. So one thing that we learned from this is that in order to get a successful application of the Quarry byproducts inside the large rocks, then we need an incremental application of the two materials together, so we cannot just spread the whole amount at once, as well as the big importance of the moisture content, because this Quarry byproduct was actually a little bit more wet than the Quarry byproduct investigated in the lab. It had a moisture content of 3.3, 3.2%. And the moisture content actually matters, and it inhibits the further percolation of Quarry byproduct. So overall, the construction of the 2 test sections with this application, we had the 2 lifts and then the 1 lift. And for the 2 lifts, we were able to put the 25% by weight of the Quarry byproduct at the higher moisture content. But for the 1 lift, because the Quarry byproduct basically has to percolate the 21-inch depth with this higher moisture content, we were only able to get 2/3 of that amount inside the lift, or almost 16.7% of Quarry byproduct by the weight of the primary crusher run aggregates. For the construction of the dense graded test section, that was a typical construction, constructed in 3 lifts. Each lift was 7 inches in depth, so I'm not showing that. Now I'm showing some results for lightweight deflectometer, which is performed on top of the final surface of the layer, as well as on top of the capping layer for all the different test sections in the construction platforms, as well as in the low volume roads. And as you see on top of the capping material, all of them were pretty similar, even though there was some variation before the capping material was inserted. Similar LWD back calculated moduli for the layers that were covered with asphalt, but this is, of course, underneath the asphalt on top of the capping layer and on top of the subgrade layer. And they're also within the same range, ranging between 180 to 260 almost megapascal modules. These are also the FWD deflection results on top of the test sections, and those FWD deflection were on top of the final surface. So for the construction platforms, which are the cell 1 south, those are on top of the capping layer. And as you can see, the maximum deflection at the drop location was range between 40 and almost 100 mils of deflection. So some sections or some points had higher deflections than others, and this correlated very well with the rutting. So sections that showed highest deflections had the highest rutting, as I will show later. This is also the same results shown for section 3 and section 4 in the construction platforms. And then for cell 1 north, which is on the top of the HMA pavement, and you can see that the deflections are lower for the HMA, ranging between 30 to 50 mils maximum for all the different test sections. Now moving to the accelerated pavement testing. So we were using the accelerated pavement tester atlas that most of you guys here are familiar with in order to test the various cells. So for the construction platform cells, we had a dipstick arrangement where we used a caliper in order to measure the rutting. This is showing upside down for some reason. Dipstick to measure the rutting in the, it's a wide-base tire. It's a 455-55 R22.5 wide-base tire. But it's showing upside down here. Sorry for that. So the tire pressure that was applied is 110 psi tire pressure. The speed was kept constant at 5 miles per hour. And the rut measurements was done regularly at 0 passes, 1 pass, and then on a logarithmic scale up to a total of 40,000 passes that were applied for the construction platforms. And this is just some pictures of performance monitoring and how the test sections were performing. So we saw in one section only some visible cracks on the sides after 100 passes, which is the section that had the plastic fines. And also we were testing when we had the incident of some heavy rain after more than 12,000 passes of Atlas on these construction platforms, and there were some fines washing out from the sections, especially in section 3, which had the plastic fines. This is a summary of some performance monitoring of different points in each section. I probably forgot to mention that in each section we had 2 points where we were measuring the rutting and all the different properties, like the LWD deflections, FWD deflections, the cores later on for the sections in the HMA, and then the trenching overall. So this is showing the rutting progression at the different number of passes for the different test sections in section 1, which is the primary crusher run with the Quarry byproduct constructed in 2 lifts, in 1 lift, and then the section with the plastic fines and non-plastic fines. I will have a summary for this later in one graph showing all sections. But overall, the section with the highest rutting was the section that had the 15% plastic fines, and especially the rutting was high after the incident of rain at some of the points where the rutting was significantly increased after the layers got wet. While the section that performed the best out of all these sections was the section with the 15% non-plastic fine, and it had the lowest rutting. And this also conforms very well with the LWD deflections, and FWD deflections, sorry, where the sections that had the highest rutting had also the highest FWD deflections, and vice versa. So this is a summary of the rutting progression up to 20,000 passes of the construction platform test sections. And as you can see here, and as I said, the section that had the best performance was section 4 with the 15% non-plastic fines, followed by the section that had the Quarry byproduct mixed with the primary crushing runs in 1 pass, and then the sections that had the Quarry byproduct constructed in 2 lifts, and the plastic fines test section. And this increase here that you see in the test sections is after the rain, the incident of the heavy rain that I was showing. Overall, our failure criteria, or the target that we were shooting for, was 75 millimeter or 3 inches of rutting in the construction platforms. And as most of you know, these construction platforms usually don't take up to 20,000 cycles. It's going to be just a few number of cycles. But we wanted to take it to the higher number of cycles and see nevertheless, we weren't getting the 3 inches rutting in any of the test sections overall. And this is the average of each section. And here I'm showing just the 2 points and how they compare. So in some test sections, they were more consistent between the 2 measuring points, such as the last section with the non-plastic fines, as well as the section 2, which is the core byproduct constructed in one lift. In the other 2 of them, they were less consistent, and there were more variability between the 2 measuring points in each section. But overall, all the rutting in these sections were following the trend of the FWD measured on the top of each point before the trafficking of the test sections. This slide shows a comparison between the test sections that are constructed with the primary crusher runs and the quarry byproducts in one lift, here, the lower one, in 2 lifts, as well as a previous study that used only the primary crusher runs without any quarry byproducts. And it was tested up to 4,000 cycles. And as you can see, those previous test sections had the same large rocks or the same primary crusher runs aggregate, the same source, the same capping material, same layer thicknesses, and the similar subgrade strength, a CBR of 1. And they were constructed in the same, almost the same location, or in the Atlas yard here. But they had significantly higher rutting compared to the ones that had the quarry byproduct blended with the primary crusher runs, which shows that this is actually working, and it's actually reducing the rutting of these layers. Now I'm moving to the performance monitoring of cell 1 North, which is the cell that has HMA paved on top of it. The same tire was used, the wide base tire, the super single tire. Same load, 10 kip load, 110 psi tire pressure, the same speed. And then for the rutting measurements, we were now using a laser profiler instead of the customized dipstick. Also showing the performance monitoring of the test sections and how they compare with each other. Again, there's some variability between the 2 points in each test section, but overall the rutting is much lower with the HMA paved as expected. And just showing the summary for all the 4 test sections. So on average, the rutting in the test sections were quite similar. The rutting value that was targeted was half an inch of rutting for a low volume road as the cap. What we saw in these test sections is that the lowest rutting was in section 2, this time not in section 4, which has the core byproduct mixed with the primary crusher runs constructed in one lift. Part of the reason for this was the higher HMA thickness on top of this section than section 4. And all 4 sections performed pretty similar, I would say. The maximum rutting was around 7 millimeter, the minimum was around 5, and they had similar rutting. This is showing the cores which we recently obtained from the test sections and how the HMA thickness is varying on top of these test sections at the different measuring points. Keep in mind that each 2 measuring points are 1 section, so this is section 1, section 2, section 3, and section 4. And as you can see here, that section 2 had the highest HMA thickness, while section 4 had almost the lowest. And there was quite a big variation between 3 inches and 5 inches at some point, while in most of the points it was between 3 1/4 and 4 inches, which was the target HMA thickness. So this explains some of the variation between the test sections is actually due to the difference in the thickness of the HMA on top of these sections. So point 3 here had the highest HMA thickness and also had the lowest FWD deflection. So there are still trends that apply. And I'm showing here just the variation between the different points in each test section and that were averaged before and shown average before, and how they vary. So again, in some sections, the variation is quite bigger. But if you look at the scale, they all were between 4.5 millimeter and almost 7.5 millimeters. So they were quite low compared to what was expected, which shows that all the test sections are working, and the quarry byproduct or the applications that were investigated for the quarry byproducts in unbound layers were actually performing well at even a high number of cycles of 90,000 cycles in total. So this ends my TRB presentation about this topic. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about another presentation that I presented at TRB by request from the AFS80 committee, which is the Standing Committee on Stabilization of Geomaterials and Recycled Materials. So the title of this presentation is the Field Performance Evaluation of the Chemically Stabilized Quarry Byproducts Used as Base and Sub-base Layers. And this is basically the test sections that were constructed in cell 2 and cell 3 of the test sections that were constructed. So the difference is that in cell 1 we had the unbound applications. Now we're talking about the chemically stabilized applications. And we had also proposed 8 different applications for quarry byproducts, or 7 different applications of quarry byproducts stabilized with either cement or fly ash, and in some cases blended with another recycled material, such as recycled concrete or wrap, and built on a subgrade 6 material. So the reason behind recycling, stabilizing the quarry byproduct is that, as you see here in those orange columns, is that the strength of the quarry byproduct by itself is very low. But when it's stabilized with fly ash or cement, as low as 2% cement or 10% fly ash, we can get unconfined compressive strength increase up to 30 times in some cases. So that's what we were investigating in the field, is to mix the quarry byproduct with cement, 3% cement or 10% fly ash, and then have some test sections where the quarry byproduct is blended with wrap or with recycled concrete, with cement or with fly ash, as well as some test sections that only have quarry byproduct by itself, cement stabilized. And we were investigating the effect of changing the type of quarry byproduct. So we had 2 different sources of quarry byproducts. That's why you see the QB2 in cell 2 here, and then the QB3 in cell 3. And we also had some sections where we had the quarry byproducts stabilized and used as sub-base material, and topped with a regular dense graded aggregate material as a base material. So 6 inches of sub-base and then 6 inches of base material, sort of an inverted pavement application of quarry byproduct. And then at the end we had a control section, which is only 12 inches of dense graded base aggregate material. So these are the quarry byproduct applications that I basically summarized. So in cell 2 we were studying the blending of the quarry byproduct with the coarse aggregate fractions of recycled materials such as wrap and RCA and other additives, which are cement and fly ash, to be used as base materials, as well as using the quarry byproduct as a cement-treated base material. And these are the 4 different test sections. And these are all low-volume applications of quarry byproducts. So they're topped with 4 inches of HMA on the surface. And they're constructed on engineered subgrade. And this time the engineered subgrade CBR is 6% CBR. These are the applications studied in cell 3, as I was mentioning also. So cement-stabilized QB3, which is a different type of QB, and then the inverted pavement applications of quarry byproduct cement-stabilized or fly ash-stabilized with 3% cement and 10% fly ash, and then topped with CS6, which is the dense graded aggregate. And then the last section is a controlled section of CS6-based material. Similar to the first presentation, there was the particle size distribution in the lab was investigated for all the different materials, and then the combination of the materials shown here on the right. These are the combination of materials that were used to construct the test sections. And then also the moisture density relationships, which was also critical in this time for the hydration of the cement and the fly ash, as well as to compact all the layers at the optimum moisture content and get the highest possible relative compaction for these test sections. Also, in the lab, we also investigated the unconfined compressive strength of the different combination of materials. So in total, there was 6 different combination of materials that we investigated and then built in the field. And as you see, the highest 2 of these were when we have the quarry byproduct mixed with another recycled material, RCA or wrap, and then cement stabilized. And the ratio of the blending was 70% of QB by weight, and then 30% of wrap or concrete, because we were trying to utilize the highest possible quantity of quarry byproduct in these applications. Some of the strengths are more statistically different than others. For example, these two sections are statistically different than when only we have the quarry byproduct stabilized with either cement or fly ash without any other recycled material, RAP or RCA. So for the field construction, QA and QC, it was similar procedures. So we had the density measured, we had the LWD and the GeoGauge deflections and modulus, so deflections and then back calculating the modulus as well as the FWD. And we also engineered the subgrade in a similar manner as I was explaining for cell 1. And these are the final results for the subgrade engineering. So the target subgrade was CBR of 6. I'm not showing the individual trials here, but only the final trials for cell 3 and cell 2, and how they come closely to a CBR 6 subgrade for all the different measuring points before we constructed the different test sections on top of them. Just quickly showing how we constructed or how we dealt with the stabilized layers for these test sections. Because we were constructing very small test sections, we sort of did the manual mixing, so we had the stockpiles of the materials, and then we were mixing the stockpiles very well with a bucket of a backhoe, adding the cement percentage as required, then mixing again, and then adding the water percentage as required. So we were measuring the moisture content before and after, and then mixing again, moving to the construction site, tilling several times in order to get uniformity, and then compacting the test sections and checking the heights and the elevations and everything. So this is also something that we did while we were constructing before the HMA was paved on top of the test sections. So we were investigating the LWD modulus and how it is changing with curing time, or the number of days between construction and before the HMA was paved for the different test sections, and how it compares for the different test sections. So in some sections, like the one that had the QB with the FRAP with the cement, we were back calculating air modulus up to 410 KSI almost on the top of the layer. For the other sections, they were lower, and especially with the one that had the fly ash had the lowest modulus of all of them after almost 10 to 14 days, depends on which section was constructed first and last for the different test sections. And that was for cell 2. For cell 3, it was done in a similar manner, and here are the results and how they vary between the different test cells. Of course, this is only the first 3, because the 4th one is just a control section, so it has no cement or fly ash to cure. Again, the one that has the cement with the quarry byproduct had the highest modulus, up to 220, 230 KSI almost, and then the ones that are the inverted pavements had lower measured modulus on top of the surface. And this is just a comparison between the last 3 sections here and how the modulus on top of the capping layer was measured. So again, the section that had an inverted pavement with cement had the highest, then the fly ash was lower, slightly higher than the control section after the construction of the test sections. Again, also performance monitoring of the test sections, similar manner. This time we went to a larger number of passes though, because we had better performance of these test sections, and some of them had a very good performance. So for the first 100,000 passes, we were using the same loads and the same tire configuration and pressures as we were using for cell 1. But we, especially for cell 2, which we have completed now, we wanted to test it for a higher number of passes and increase the load and the tire pressure in order to see if we can accelerate the damage even more, because some sections had very good performance. Also, in some of the test sections, or in 4 of them to be exact, we also instrumented the test sections on top of the subgrade with soil pressure cells, which Professor Al-Qadi kindly helped us with the field installation of these with his expertise. So those test sections that were instrumented were the first and last test section of cell 2, which are the one that has the quarry byproduct with the wrap and the cement, and the quarry byproduct only with the cement. And then in cell 3, one of the inverted pavement test section, which is the one that had the quarry byproduct with cement as a subbase, and the control section at the end. And we were also monitoring and collecting data from the pressure cells and from thermocouples for temperature along the experiment done. Moving to the performance monitoring, here I'm just showing an example. For cell 1, I showed all the results and how they varied. In cell 3 and 2, I'm showing an example because there are another 8 sections. And then I have all the results summarized on the next slides. So this is, for example, for cell 3, section 3 with the inverted pavement and how the rutting is accumulating up to 50,000 passes of the wheel, the Atlas wheel. And this is a summary slide for the rutting accumulation for cell 2, the 4 different test sections up to 135,000 passes. As I was mentioning, after 100,000 passes, the load was increased as well as the pressure. And if you can just in particular pay attention to these 2 test sections here, the lowest 2, which are the one that have the RAP or the RCA mixed with cement. And these were showing very superior performance. They only accumulated less than 2 millimeter of rutting after 135,000 passes. The section that had the worst performance, which still performed very, very good, like 8 millimeters only of rutting after 135,000 passes, is much lower than what our target was of half an inch of rutting. But is this section that has the fly ash, and this section is also, if you remember the LWD, the deflections and back calculated modules that I was showing, had the lowest out of all of them. So even here, the trend is similar to the LWD deflections that were measured at different curing times. Now moving to the performance monitoring of cell 3, similar manner. I'm only showing here the results of 50,000 passes, and we have completed up to 100,000 passes, but we didn't complete the experiment yet. We're hoping that we can complete it sometime soon. So the 3 test sections that had the Quarry byproduct cement stabilized, as well as the inverted test sections, had low, relatively low rutting accumulation up to the 50,000 passes, and that was less than 5 millimeter after 50,000 passes. While the control section actually had a very high or steep increase in rutting over the time, and we were also seeing some cracks on the sides of the control section. I also mentioned that we had some soil pressure cells embedded on top of the subgrade in the different test sections, and I'm here showing some results for static loading of the pressure cells. So we were moving the tire on top of the pressure cell and then recording the pressure on top of the subgrade. Here is shown for cell 2 for the 2 different pressures. So the light blue one is for the 110 psi experiment when we were doing the passes be less than 100,000, and then the top one here is for the passes up to 135,000, and it's showing 3 different loads. So for the 110 psi, we had the 5 kip, 7.5 kip, and 10 kip, and then unload. For the 125 psi pressure, we had the 7.5 kip load, 10 kip load, and then 14 kip load, and then measuring the pressure. So this is a summary of the 2 test sections in cell 2 that were instrumented with soil pressure cells. So section 1 and section 4. And as you can see, this is the pressure on top of the subgrade. The maximum that we had when we had up to 100,000 cycles was 2.5 psi of subgrade pressure, which is considered relatively low. Usually we're targeting less than 6 or 7 psi of subgrade pressure in order to limit the rutting of the subgrade. When we increase the load from the pressure, from 110 psi to 125 psi, and then increase the load from 10 kip to 14 kip, then we also saw some increase in the pressures that are recorded on top of the test sections. In particular, they were higher for section 4, which didn't have the RAP and only had the Quarry byproduct mixed with the cement. This is similar results shown from cell 3 this time, the 2 test sections that were instrumented from cell 3. Similar manner, static loading, 5 kip, 7.5 kip, and 10 kip. This time you see much less noise because we were able to handle the noise better. We were able to turn off the engine of Atlas while we doing the measurements, which reduced the load. And you see how the pressure were recorded up to the 10 kip load. And then this is a summary of the result from the 2 test sections in cell 3, so point 3 and point 4, which is the test section with the inverted pavement and then the control test section. So for the inverted pavement test section, we're also in the same range of 2 psi subgrade pressure on top of the subgrade, which is low. For the control section, we're up to 8 psi, and at some points even up to a 10 psi pressure on top of the subgrade, which is considered relatively high for the subgrade, and it means that we can be seeing some subgrade rutting in this section. So I showed the results individually for cell 2 and cell 3, and how do they compare together? So if we put everything together, all the 8 test sections from cell 1 and cell 2, you can see that all the stabilized test sections are here. And the worst performer here, which is still performing good, is the one that has the fly ash with the QB with the frap, while the control section is showing very high rutting. And it's not clear here, but I have a zoomed in picture, and also it's very clear here for the control section that at one point after 30,000 cycles, we see that the rate of rutting is decreasing. And the main reason for this is actually the drop in temperatures, which led to more stiff asphalt and reduced the rutting of the section. So this is the zoomed in test sections, and now we can compare all the different test sections. So overall, test sections in cell 2 performed better than cell 3, which are the dashed lines. But still, after 50,000 passes, all test sections had less than 5 millimeters of rutting, which is quite good and shows that QB are performing actually better than what we expected, because when we envisioned and constructed these test sections, we had in mind low volume applications for low volume road applications for the quarry byproduct. But with this rutting accumulation rates, they probably can be even used for medium volume roads or higher e-cells or higher traffic. And lastly, this is the soil pressure cell results compared together. So these are the 3 stabilized test sections. And then this is the control test section. And you can see that with the control test section, we had, or we measured much higher subgrade pressure on top of subgrade, while for the stabilized sections, it was in the range of the 2 psi pressure. And this is the last slide, and this is the temperature drop that I was mentioning at 30,000 passes. And these are the temperature data for the different test sections collected and measured. And it shows that after 30,000 passes, there was a drop, significant drop in temperature, and that was leading to slowing down the rutting because of the stiffening of the asphalt. Finally, I would like to acknowledge everyone who has helped on this project, Professor Al-Qadi, who helped us with the instrumentation of the pressure cells, my research group, Professor Tutumlar's research group, and then Professor Al-Qadi's research group, because of their significant involvement with the field construction and after the construction. Research engineers here at ATRL, Greg Renshaw, Michael Johnson, James Meister, as well as Chenghua Wu and Mark Killian for their contribution to this study. And thank you, everyone, for your listening. Any questions? Yes?
In the first presentation, I think it was like slide 16, you were talking about the box, and you're doing the packing test, and you determined that 25% quarry byproduct was optimal. Mm-hmm. What was the evaluation criteria for picking it? You may have mentioned it, I missed it.
No, actually, I didn't mention it. So the evaluation criteria is that we were looking at the surface after vibrating the QB from the surface. So how much QB is left on the surface? Are we left with a significant amount of QB, or is the total amount actually percolating through the rocks or not? So that's what, when I mentioned that it was more of a qualitative investigation than a quantitative investigation, because initially we didn't know how much QP to pack. So we had, the idea was to measure what is the void ratio that we have between the large rocks, and that's when we calculated that the void ratio is around 45%. So we knew that this is probably the maximum amount of quarry byproduct that we can pack. But are we going to be able to pack this, or are we going to still be left with voids that are not going to be filled? So that's when we were investigating different quantities, and that's when we found that if we add 25% of QB that is that has some moisture, or 2.5% moisture content is what we tested, then we can actually fill the voids without getting QB to be left on the surface significantly. When we were testing the dry QB, And on the dry QB, we were able to fit up to 30% and in some cases 35% of QB in the voids. But when it's wet, and that was one of the conclusions of that study, is that moisture content has a big effect on the amount of QB that can percolate. So we moved down to 25% of QB.
Real quick follow-up.
Yes.
So the moisture content issue, you wanted, I assume you went with that level because it's realistic of what construction conditions might be.
Yeah, so when we
you're not
did
going
it,
to have oven dry.
exactly. So when we did it in the lab, the moisture content that was targeted is the actual moisture content that we had when we collected the samples from the quarries. But before the construction, we had some rain, so those stockpiles were wet. What we did is that we went ahead and we spread them on, like in the big yard, in the backyard of Atrial, just to try to dry them as much as possible. But then when we calculated the moisture content after the construction or within the construction, the moisture content was still higher than what we tested in the lab. That's why in that section that we had, the 21 inches one lift section, we were only able to put 2/3 of the amount of the 25% went down to almost 17%.
Thanks.
Yes?
I think he was first.
Yeah,
Just a very short follow-up with Mike's question. When you are designing this box, because we all know in real pigment situations, it's infinite in X and Y plane, but in your box it's like a constrained boundary.
Right.
So is that going to be, is that going to affect your results, or it's under control?
No, definitely it's going to affect the result, but the size of the box that was chosen is the 24 inches size was chosen on purpose because the largest aggregate size that we had was 6 inches. And in order to minimize the boundary conditions, usually you go to 3 times higher than your maximum aggregate size, so that's a 6 inch. And 6 times 3 is 18, and we had 24. So that's how you minimize the boundary effects. You would still have boundary effects, and in order to minimize it, we had to go to a larger box, which is a 24 by 24 inches.
Oh, thank you.
Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little irrelevant, but I was wondering if it's are you going to look, or have you looked if the impact of the use of Quarry byproduct on the permeability of the pavement structure of the base layers, or are you going to do some recommendation in terms of permeability, or it's kind of
We didn't in particular look at the permeability and the impact on the permeability. We didn't have any issues with the drainage in the test section to start with, but what we wanted to look at, not in particular the permeability, but something related, is what happens if we actually submerge those test sections, if we have water filling those test sections, and does that actually lower our strength? Does that move our Quarry byproducts to the bottom, or what's going to happen? So we investigated with that. We actually went outside and we put water hoses for some time. We turned off the drainage, and we did FWD before and after to compare what was the deflections. And just by looking at the FWD deflections in those sections, we didn't see any change or a significant change. What was interesting is that when we submerged the stabilized test sections, in some of them we saw some big change in deflections of FWD when the Quarry byproduct was stabilized. But for those applications, it didn't give a big difference. But we didn't have issues with drainage. We had good drainage through the sections, partly because those voids aren't completely full with Quarry byproducts. You still have large voids structure.
One idea that came was like, how about thinking about hydraulic fill type of application, getting the sand size Quarry byproduct into those voids, large voids. And well, that also tells us that we don't care. It's the flooding the section basically. But well, that's true because it's already swamp, CBR1, that we're dumping the rocks, and we're making rocks now more stable by actually putting the sand to fill the gaps and voids, right? So that's one way to get the sand down or QB down as hydraulic fill. So I think that's the thing that Issam was mentioning. You also tried with the flushing.
Any more question? Right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming.